the idea of Supergrids. So I saw this video on YouTube from Bloomberg, which was covering sort of the history of power grids and electricity and how we started off with DC current and the limitations there where it couldn't be sort of delivered over long distances. Then transitioning over to alternating current, which we're mostly using now to deliver power to so many places. But we're now running into this issue of transitioning over to renewable energy sources. And the biggest issue there is that unlike in the good old days with fossil fuels, we could just build the plant where we needed the power to come from, whereas with renewables, we have to build the hardware where the power has to be generated, which leads to an obvious problem. How do you get, say, wind power that's in the middle of nowhere transferred over to where it needs to be delivered without any loss of power along the way? And I thought this concept of high voltage direct current, that was what they were talking about, was quite interesting, and how it's all being worked on now. Now, they obviously went down the path of putting this in the context of a supergrid. So instead of, say, a grid that functions within a country like it does now, alternating current grid, this high voltage DC grid would actually be interconnecting nations, and where there were, say, shortfalls somewhere, or say one country is delivering more power that's in excess, they can deliver it to another country that's running short, which is a nice idea. But obviously, we'll talk about it a bit later, but obviously the biggest hurdle there is getting cooperation between countries to make that work. So it was quite a fascinating little thing to think about, and also in the broader topic of addressing things like climate change, etc., and getting more of this renewable technology up and running.
Yeah, it's a very interesting video, well worth a look. I mean, it sort of made me think they actually point up the original current wars between Edison and Tesla at the start of the video, and I think this is actually probably the start of a new current war. Basically your renewables produce the electricity in DC, and that's converted to AC when we go back into the grid. And there are remarkable advantages through DC power, and as they point out in the video, we now have the technology to run grids DC direct. So that's very exciting. But and where we have surplus, I guess, renewable energy, to transport it around will become the purpose of the grid. And I think that's a subtle difference here between the idea of an AC grid, where you just pump the power out and it can travel long distances, and it was always about supplying a community around that power station. Whereas now with direct current and the technologies that they have, we could send power effectively across whole nations. And as they point out, nations are connected, and this will effectively become the transport power, system for moving power around the globe. Great idea. I'm sure it's very expensive, and there's, it's very Star Trek in a lot of its aims, and, it'll be wonderful for everyone, and there's probably a lot of money to be made. But the flip side is the decentralized grid, and I think this is where probably the future war will be, which would be that maybe you only need a community of 10,000 people in an area where renewables such as solar are in abundance, and effectively you could power a whole community that way without needing to be connected to the grid. However, if you did want to export your energy and participate in a global market, competing for your power, then obviously you'd need a line into that supergrid. So it's fascinating. I think it's definitely shows that the technologies are changing, and the way which we will produce power in the future and consume power in the future as nations will change. But these are the sorts of technologies that I look at, and they didn't really exist 10 or 20 years ago, but these are the technologies that will get us to zero emission.
You make a good point with the fact that there could be alternative solutions like a decentralized grid or whatever. But one of the things that they point out in terms of challenges for the supergrid wasn't actually the technology itself. It was the getting agreement from all interested parties to participate and I guess agree on a centralized, set of regulations or whatever that you want to get through. And then they had the story in America where it was 17 years worth of negotiating with a whole bunch of different landowners and whatever to get the right to put up power lines, etc., through various parts of the country in order to set up part of a super grid in that way. And then the flip side with with the minor sort of like the decentralized grid that you were saying, that you have less people that you have to get agreements on to sort of get it up and running. But then that kind of leads me to like a thought of there isn't that catch-all solution. Like, why can't it be a mixture of approaches? Because it seems like the mixture of approaches might be the only way to do it, so that you avoid regulatory issues or regulatory delays, I should say, and then also the inevitable issues of trying to get, like, say, 2 or 3 or 4 or more countries to agree on a set of rules and regulations around how that grid is set up and also how it functions.
Yeah, look, I think I personally don't think it will be that difficult to get agreement. I think it's because there's nothing like this currently. But you have an international fossil fuel trade, you have all sorts of commodities traded. Power is just another commodity. If this was the status quo, we would already have regulations. We would have already overcome all these obstacles. So to me, these obstacles are what would have to happen in any case. And look, there are people who work on these sorts of regulations full time, international trade, treaties, etc., etc. Gas passes from one country to another, no problems. I think we can manage that with a cable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe for one more devil's advocate argument there. Like, if you think about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the flow of fossil fuels out of Russia and cutting that off, and I guess it was kind of like an unexpected impact that might have had in the short to medium term to try and work around. That's probably a good example of where there can be issues. But again, I guess that's something that can't be avoided given the nature of humanity, really.
Oh, that's right. But a super grid would have such a global network, which is what they're trying to achieve, that if part of the network went down for whatever reason, whether it's sanctions or natural disaster, the rest of the network would continue. So, ultimately, this really is a very futuristic, as they point out in the video, approach. And, supergrids might not quite be there by 2050, but they'll definitely be there by 2100.
Absolutely. All right, Steve, we might wrap it up there. I'm looking forward to that Star Trek future, even if it might take a while to get there with a few bumps along the road.
Well, how else are we going to, recharge our electric passenger planes?